The entire Thorn mansion went silent. It was not the kind of silence that follows a dropped glass or a shouted command. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that occurs when someone finally does the unthinkable. In the center of the grand marble foyer, beneath a chandelier that cast sharp, cold light over the assembly, Saraphina stood like a dark ermine. Her blonde hair was pulled into a bun, so tight it seemed to pull at her very eyes, and her black gown absorbed the light around her, making her appear as a void in the middle of the room. The staff was lined up like soldiers for the morning inspection, maids, cooks, and guards, all with their chins tucked and their eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the storm to pass. Saraphina had been in a foul mood since sunrise, and everyone knew that she only felt powerful when she was making someone else feel small. She stopped in front of Maya, the new maid who had only arrived days prior to help settle her father's mounting debts. To Saraphina, Maya was just a tan uniform, a nameless face to be crushed under the weight of her ego. But Maya was different. While the older maids moved like ghosts through the hallways, Maya's eyes held a quiet, dangerous strength, a moral absolutism that refused to allow her to become a doormat. "You missed a spot on the banister," Saraphina hissed, her voice low and sharp like a razor blade. "Or perhaps your village upbringing didn't teach you how to see quality." Maya didn't flinch. She didn't bow her head or offer the rehearsed apology that the other servants had perfected. Instead, she stood her ground, her hands folded neatly in front of her. This lack of visible fear was an insult to Saraphina's authority. The tension peaked in a heartbeat. Saraphina's face twisted in a mask of sudden, volatile anger. She raised her black-gloved hand high, moving with the practiced swiftness of a woman who had slapped dozens of workers into submission before. The other maids gasped, some even closing their eyes, too terrified to watch the inevitable impact. They expected the sound of skin hitting skin, a gunshot of humiliation that would echo through the hall, but the slap never landed. The sound that filled the room was the soft, firm thud of Maya's hand catching Saraphina's wrist mid-air. Maya didn't grab her fearfully. She held her firmly, like a small tree refusing to bend in a gale. The revolution wasn't in the violence, but in the refusal. For a long, agonizing second, the two women were locked in a stalemate. Maya looked Saraphina directly in the eye, her gaze calm and unshaking, shattering the illusion that the billionaire's fiancé was untouchable. "Do not," Maya said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of thunder. "I am here to work, not to be your target." Saraphina's eyes widened in total disbelief, her mouth hanging open as she struggled to process that a mere maid was physically restraining her. She tried to yank her hand free, but Maya's grip was steady, a physical manifestation of a dignity that wealth could not buy. The air in the mansion changed in that moment, turning cold and heavy with the realization that the old rules no longer applied. Unknown to the two women, Victor Thorne stood just outside the hallway, the silver-haired billionaire, a man who had lived his life in a state of clinical detached boredom, had stopped in his tracks. He had watched the scene unfold from the shadows, expecting the usual display of his fiancée's dominance. But as he witnessed Maya's act of defiance, something inside him finally woke up. He didn't move or speak. He simply watched, his heart beating faster as he realized he was seeing the truth of his household for the very first time. He saw the woman he was supposed to marry, trying to strike a servant, and he saw a maid with the courage to stop her, a courage he hadn't realized he was lacking in his own life. "Let go of me," Saraphina finally shrieked, her voice cracking with embarrassment. She realized the entire staff was witnessing her loss of control. "Let go this instant." Maya released the wrist, but she did not back down. She simply took a half step back, her posture straight, her eyes still locked on the woman in black. Saraphina stumbled back, clutching her arm as if it had been burned, her face turning a deep humiliated red. Every worker in the room held their breath, waiting for the billionaire to step forward and end the maid's career. Or worse. But as Victor stepped into the light, his expression wasn't one of anger directed at Maya. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment, directed at the woman who wore his engagement ring. This single moment of intervention had changed everything. The gold leaf on the walls and the sparkling chandeliers could no longer hide the rot that had been allowed to fester in the Thorn mansion. The invisible maid had finally become seen, and the Ice Queen had finally been challenged. The story of their conflict was no longer a secret kept by the staff. It was a battle for the soul of the house that had only just begun. The Thorn estate sat atop the cliffs like a crown of glass and cold stone, beautiful to look at, but jagged to the touch. Maya arrived at the service entrance with a single battered suitcase and a heavy heart, her thoughts anchored to the mounting debts her father had accrued back in their small village. As she stepped through the threshold, the warmth of the morning sun seemed to vanish, replaced by a clinical sterile chill that permeated the air. She was met by the head housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gale, whose face was a map of etched lines and whose eyes never seemed to rise above the level of a person's collar. There was no welcome, only a set of tan uniforms and a list of rules that felt more like a survival manual than a job description. As Maya began her first rounds, she realized the mansion was a place of high-gloss surfaces and low whispered warnings. The other maids moved through the vaulted corridors like shadows, their footsteps silenced by thick Persian rugs and an even thicker sense of dread. When Maya tried to offer a friendly greeting to a girl polishing the silver, the girl flinched, her eyes darting toward the grand staircase before she scurried away without a word. It wasn't just professional decorum. It was a pervasive, bone-deep fear that dictated every movement in the house. The source of that fear became clear during the afternoon shift when the heavy double doors of the master suite swung open. Saraphina emerged, draped in sharp black silk, her blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She didn't walk, she prowled the hallways, her presence acting as a physical weight that forced the staff to shrink against the walls. Maya watched from an alcove as Saraphina stopped in front of an older laundress. With a flick of her gloved hand, Saraphina tossed a silk scarf onto the floor, claiming it hadn't been pressed with respect. The laundress didn't defend herself. She simply dropped to her knees to retrieve it, her hands trembling so violently that the silk rustled like dry leaves. Maya felt a hot spark of indignation rise in her chest, but she remembered her father's tired eyes and stayed silent. She realized then that the glass house was a misnomer. It was a cage where the bars were made of Seraphina's whims, and the floor was littered with the broken spirits of those who needed a paycheck more than their dignity. The billionaire, Victor Thorn, was a ghost in his own home, a man of silver hair and cold efficiency, who moved through the rooms with a detached gaze, seemingly blind to the psychological warfare his fiancée waged on the help. By the end of the day, Maya's back ached, but her mind was sharper than ever. She saw the rules of survival for what they were, a system designed to strip a person of their humanity until they were nothing more than a tool. Every time Saraphina raised her voice, or leveled a cold mocking stare at a servant, the fear in the room thickened until it was almost impossible to breathe. Maya realized she hadn't just taken a job. She had entered a lion's den where the predator wore diamonds and the prey was expected to thank her for the privilege of being hunted. She looked at her reflection in the polished marble of the foyer, a nameless girl in a tan uniform, and made a silent vow that while she might be poor, she would not become a ghost. In the days following the incident in the foyer, the air in the Thorn mansion remained charged, like the static before a lightning strike. Victor Thorn, a man who had built an empire on data and cold logic, found himself unable to return to his usual state of detached indifference. From the glass-walled sanctuary of his study, he found his gaze drifting not toward his monitor, but toward the gardens and corridors where the girl in the tan uniform moved. Maya did not scuttle like the others. She walked with a purposeful rhythmic grace that suggested her spirit remained entirely her own, untouched by the oppressive weight of the house. Driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite name,
Victor began to orchestrate small, unnecessary reasons to bring her into his orbit. He bypassed the head housekeeper and the usual protocols, requesting Maya specifically for menial tasks that he usually ignored. He asked her to reorganize the first editions in his private library, a room he rarely visited, and to refresh the water in the crystal carrés on his desk 3 times a day. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she worked, waiting for the mask of the subservient maid to slip. He expected to see a flash of the same calculating ambition he saw in the eyes of his business rivals, or perhaps the trembling terror he saw in the rest of his staff. But Maya offered him neither. When she entered his study, she didn't bow or avert her eyes in that frantic, submissive way that had started to grate on his nerve. One afternoon, as she carefully dusted a sculpture he had purchased more for its price tag than its beauty, Victor finally spoke, his voice breaking a silence that had lasted nearly an hour. He asked her what she thought of the piece, expecting a sycophantic compliment or a quiet "I wouldn't know, sir." Instead, Maya paused her cloth mid-air and looked at the jagged bronze shape with a critical eye. She told him quite plainly that it looked like a man trying to scream while someone was holding his throat shut. The honesty hit Victor with the force of a physical blow. In a world where his board of directors nodded at every whim, and Saraphina curated every smile to match the color of his mood, Maya was a sudden, jarring burst of reality. He realized with a sense of startling clarity that she was the only person in his multi-billion-dollar life who wasn't lying to him. She didn't want his favor. She wanted her dignity, and she wasn't willing to trade one for the other. As he watched her finish her work and exit the room with a polite, level-headed nod, Victor felt a crack form in the ice that had surrounded his heart for years. He wasn't just observing a maid anymore. He was witnessing a person, and for a man who lived in a house of glass and ghosts, that was the most dangerous discovery of all. The shift in the mansion's atmosphere was subtle at first, a tightening of the coil that only those living under its roof could feel. Saraphina had seen the way Victor's eyes lingered on the library door after Maya exited. She had noticed the slight, uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice when he spoke of household schedules. To anyone else, Victor Thorne was as unreadable as a stone monument, but Saraphina had spent years studying his shadows, and she knew that the invisible maid had become a focal point. She realized that Maya's physical defiance in the foyer had been a mere opening gambit. The real threat lay in the girl's quiet integrity, a quality that acted as a mirror, reflecting Saraphina's own vanity and Victor's growing isolation. The black gloves that Saraphina wore became a symbol of the new regime. She no longer reached out to strike. Instead, she used those gloved hands to point, to command, and to weave a web of exhaustion around Maya. If she could not break the girl's spirit with a blow, she would drown it in the relentless tide of labor. Saraphina began to craft a schedule that defied the laws of human endurance, ensuring that Maya was the first to wake and the last to sleep. It started with emergency deep cleans of the wine cellar at 3 in the morning, and ended with the hand scrubbing of the stone terrace under the glare of security floodlights long after midnight. Maya's life became a blurred cycle of steam, lye, and the stinging scent of lemon oil. She moved through the mansion on 20-hour shifts, her feet throbbing and her eyes heavy with a fatigue that felt like lead in her veins. Saraphina took a sadistic pleasure in the timing of her command. Just as Maya would finish polishing the grand staircase, Saraphina would walk down it, intentionally spilling a glass of red wine or tracking mud from the garden across the wood. "It seems you've lost your touch, Maya," she would whisper, her voice a silk-wrapped needle. "Start again from the top." The psychological pressure was far more corrosive than the physical toil. Saraphina ensured that Maya was isolated, forbidding the other staff from speaking to her or sharing their meals. She would leave disparaging notes tucked into Maya's cleaning supplies, mocking her family's poverty and reminding her that one single mistake would lead to her father's ruin. Maya became a pariah in a tan uniform, a girl walking the halls of a palace while carrying the weight of a dungeon. Yet, even as the dark circles beneath her eyes deepened and her hands grew raw from the harsh chemicals, Maya refused to give Saraphina the satisfaction of a tear or a plea for mercy. Victor watched this escalation with a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite articulate. He saw Maya in the early hours of the morning, her silhouette small and lonely against the vastness of the estate, moving with a dogged mechanical persistence. He saw the way Saraphina watched her from the balconies, her eyes cold and predatory, waiting for the moment the girl would finally collapse. The black glove was no longer just an accessory. It was a shadow hanging over the house, a sign that the fiancé was prepared to turn the entire estate into a machine designed for a single purpose: the systematic breaking of a maid who had dared to hold her head high. Maya knew the stakes had changed. This was no longer about a job or a debt. It was a war of attrition, and every hour of forced labor was a battle for her own soul. The clock in the grand hallway chimed 3 in the morning, a lonely metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through Maya's very bones. Her vision was beginning to fray at the edges, the world turning into a soft, dizzying blur of shadows and sharp highlights. She had been awake for 22 hours, fueled by nothing but bitter coffee and the stubborn refusal to let Saraphina see her stumble. Her current task was the deep cleaning of the private study adjacent to the master suite, a room filled with heavy mahogany furniture and the lingering, suffocating scent of Saraphina's expensive floral perfume. As Maya moved the heavy velvet cushions of the chairs long to vacuum the crevices, her hand brushed against something hard and misplaced. It was tucked deep into the lining of the furniture, hidden away from any casual glance. Reaching in, she pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, its cover stained a deep bruised purple. It didn't look like the official accounting books Maya had seen on Victor's desk. It looked personal, secretive, and entirely out of place in a room that was supposed to be a sanctuary of shared life. Exhaustion momentarily vanished as Maya opened the first page. Her eyes, red-rimmed from lack of sleep, struggled to focus on the elegant, loopy handwriting she recognized instantly as Saraphina's. It wasn't a diary of emotions, but a meticulous record of things. Page after page was filled with columns of numbers, dates, and names of shell companies that meant nothing to the world but everything to the Thorne estate. Maya traced her finger over entries documenting massive transfers from Victor's secondary accounts, funds designated for charitable foundations, employee pensions, and overseas investments, all redirected into private offshore holdings. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. While Victor was distracted by the global movements of his empire, Saraphina was methodically hollowing it out from the inside. She wasn't just planning to marry for wealth. She was actively harvesting it before the vows were even spoken. There were notations about jewelry that had been reported lost to insurance companies, only to be sold through private brokers in Zurich. There were kickbacks from vendors and forged invoices for renovations that had never occurred. Saraphina was building a fortress of stolen gold, ensuring that whether the marriage lasted or not, she would walk away with a king's ransom. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the danger of what she held. She realized that this was why the fear in the house was so thick. Saraphina wasn't just a cruel woman, she was a criminal who needed a terrified, silent staff to act as her blindfold. If anyone looked too closely at the books or questioned a missing piece of silver, they weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat to her empire of lies. The sound of a heavy footstep in the corridor outside made Maya free. She quickly shoved the ledger back into its hiding place, her mind racing. She was no longer just a maid struggling to pay a debt. She was now the keeper of the truth that could dismantle the Thorne dynasty. As the door handle turned, Maya grabbed her cleaning cloth and began to polish the mahogany table with a feverish mechanical intensity. Her head bowed low. She knew that the ledger was a weapon, one that could either save her or bury her forever. And for the first time in the Thorne mansion, the fear she felt wasn't for herself. It was for the man who was being bled dry by the woman he intended to call his wife. The following night, the mansion was entombed in a silence so profound it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Maya moved through the shadows of the kitchen, her movements fluid and practiced, despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. The ledger she had discovered the night before felt like a physical weight in her mind, a secret so heavy it made every step feel precarious. She had crept down for a cup of black coffee, something to sharpen her senses for the final 3 hours of her shift, when she saw a sliver of light spilling from the breakfast nook. Victor Thorne was sitting there alone, stripped of the sharp charcoal suit and the armor of his corporate persona. He wore a simple silk robe, his silver hair slightly unkempt, staring into the dark garden through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the table before him sat a single untouched glass of scotch. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man lost in the vastness of his own museum. When Maya entered, she paused, ready to retreat into the shadows as the rules dictated. But Victor didn't turn away. He looked at her reflection in the glass, his eyes tired and searching. "You're still awake," he remarked, his voice a low rasp that lacked its usual edge of authority. He didn't phrase it as a question or a reprimand. It was an observation of a shared reality. Maya hesitated, then stepped into the light, the steam from her own mug rising in a thin pale rib. She told him that sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford until the silver was polished and the morning prep was complete. Victor let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eye. He confessed that he often stayed awake simply because the silence of the house grew too loud at night, a vast, echoing emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. He spoke then of the loneliness that came with the Thorn name, the way people looked at him and saw a bank vault rather than a person, the way every hand extended toward him usually had a price attached. He spoke of Saraphina as if he were trying to convince himself of a truth that was slipping away, mentioning her beauty and her social standing as if they were bullet points on a balance sheet. He admitted that he had hoped marriage would finally provide a sense of partnership, a way to anchor himself in a world that felt increasingly untethered. Maya listened, her grip tightening on her mind. The moral absolutism that Saraphina so despised surged within her, overriding the instinct for self-preservation. She looked at the man who owned everything yet possessed nothing of substance. She told him, her voice steady and devoid of the feigned sweetness he was used to, that a partnership wasn't built on fear and that a home shouldn't feel like a high-fancy prison. She spoke of the staff, of the way they held their breath when his fiancée entered a room, and the way the atmosphere of the house was curated to keep him isolated and dependent. "A cage is still a cage, Mr. Thorne," she said, her eyes meeting his with a piercing clarity. "Even if the bars are made of gold and the person holding the key wears a diamond ring, you aren't building a life with her, you're being managed by her." The air in the room seemed to crackle with the weight of her words. Victor didn't shout. He didn't fire her. He simply sat in the burgeoning silence, the scotch in his glass catching the light like a trapped ember. For the first time he saw the Ice Queen through Maya's eyes, not as a refined socialite but as a ward. Maya's honesty was a cold splash of water on a man who had been sleepwalking through his own life. As she turned to leave him with his thoughts, the look on Victor's face suggested that the foundation of his trust had not just cracked, it had begun to crumble. The morning following Maya's conversation with Victor brought a change in Saraphina that was as sudden as it was suspicious. The cold, sharp edges of her personality seemed to soften into a practiced, honeyed warmth that made the rest of the staff exchange nervous, sidelong glance. Saraphina summoned Maya to the grand dressing room, a place of mirrors and silk where the light felt artificial and blinding. There was no shouting, no demands for impossible labor. Instead, Saraphina stood by a velvet-covered mannequin, her black-gloved fingers tracing the lace of a gown that shimmered like moonlight on water. With a smile that didn't reach her predatory eyes, Saraphina announced that she had been too hard on the new girl. She claimed that Victor had mentioned Maya's hard work, and in a gesture of supposed goodwill she wanted Maya to have the dress, a designer piece worth more than Maya's father earned in a year. It was a poisoned gift, wrapped in the guise of an apology. Maya felt the trap closing before a single word was uttered. But to refuse a direct gift from the mistress of the house was a fireable offense. She accepted the garment with a shallow bow, her skin crawling as the silk slid into her hands like a cold golden snake. The trap was sprung 2 hours later, timed perfectly for when Victor was hosting a luncheon for his most influential business associates in the dining hall below. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered by a piercing scream from the upper floor. Saraphina descended the grand staircase, her hair disheveled and her face a mask of practiced hysterics. She wailed that her legacy sapphire brooch, a Thorne family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations, was missing from her jewelry box. Within minutes the mansion was swarming with private security and the local police, who were well acquainted with Saraphina's social standing, arrived with sirens muted but intent clear. Saraphina pointed a trembling gloved finger toward the servants' quarter. She suggested, with a sob that sounded remarkably like a snarl, that perhaps she had been too trusting of the new girl she had tried to befriend. The officers moved with a brutal efficiency that ignored Maya's protest. They bypassed the older staff and went straight for Maya's small, cramped room in the attic. There, tucked neatly beneath the gifted dress Saraphina had insisted she take, lay the sapphire brooch. Its blue heart pulsed with a mocking light against the plain wooden floor. The scene in the foyer was a masterclass in psychological execution. As the officers led Maya out in handcuffs, Saraphina stood at the top of the stairs, a handkerchief pressed to her eyes, playing the role of the betrayed benefactor. The other maids wept in the shadows, paralyzed by the realization that if the strong one could be broken so easily, none of them stood a chance. Victor emerged from the dining hall, his face pale, caught between the evidence of his own eyes and the memory of the honest woman who had spoken to him by the light of a single lamp the night before.
Maya's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but as the police gripped her arms to drag her away, she didn't scream or beg. She looked past the officers and the chaos, locking eyes with Victor. In that gaze, she didn't offer a plea. She offered a challenge. She let him see the cold, calculated triumph in Saraphina's posture. She let him see the gift for what it truly was, not a gesture of kindness, but a silken shroud meant to bury the truth she carried. As the heavy oak doors of the mansion swung shut behind her, the poisoned gift had accomplished its goal. Maya was gone, and the only voice left to whisper in the billionaire's ear belonged to the woman who was systematically destroying him. The flashing blue lights of the police cruiser sliced through the heavy afternoon mist of the Thorne estate, casting jagged shadows against the gravel driveway. Inside the car, Maya sat with her wrists bound, her face pressed against the cold glass, watching the looming silhouette of the mansion recede. She felt the crushing weight of the setup, the way the silk dress and the sapphire had been woven into a noose around her neck. But as the cruiser reached the iron perimeter gates, the heavy black bars did not swing open. Instead, a silver SUV roared across the path, skidding to a halt, and blocking the exit with a screech of tires that tore through the silence. Victor Thorne stepped out of the vehicle. Before it had even finished settling, he didn't look like the detached billionaire who analyzed spreadsheets and avoided conflict. He looked like a man possessed by a cold, surgical fury. He ignored the confused shouts of the officers and walked straight to the cruiser, his hand slamming against the hood to signal them to stop. The lead officer rolled down his window, stammering a protest about protocol and the clear evidence found in the maid's room. But Victor silenced him with a single icy stare. He didn't ask for Maya's release. He commanded it, stating that as the head of the Thorne household and the legal owner of the stolen property, he would not press charges until a full internal inquiry was conducted under his roof. The procession returned to the mansion, not as a triumph for justice, but as a funeral march for Saraphina's composure. Victor led the group into the grand library, the very room where Maya had once told him the truth about his art and his life. He ordered the officers to stand by the door and signaled for the head housekeeper to bring Saraphina down. The air in the library was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Maya was instructed to stand on one side of the massive mahogany desk, her hands still trembling, but her chin held high, while Victor sat in the high-backed leather chair, looking less like a judge and more like an executioner. Saraphina entered the room with a flurry of silk and indignant gasps, her black gloves clutching a lace handkerchief. She began to protest immediately, her voice rising in a pitch of practiced outrage, claiming that Victor was traumatizing her by forcing her to remain in the same room as a common thief. She spoke of the sanctity of their upcoming marriage and the insult of having her word questioned. But Victor remained silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the sapphire brooch that sat like a drop of frozen poison on the desk between them. "This is not a negotiation, Saraphina," Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level that made the officers at the door shift uncomfortably. "This is a trial. You claim Maya stole the brooch. Maya claims she was in this house. The truth has become a rare commodity, and I intend to find it." He turned his gaze to Maya, giving her the floor. He didn't ask her if she did it. He asked her why the sapphire would be under a dress she had just been gifted. Maya didn't waste time on tears. She spoke with the same moral absolutism that had defined her since the first day she caught Saraphina's wrist. She detailed the gift of the dress, the timing of the discovery, and the way the other staff members were being terrorized into silence. But she didn't stop at the brooch. She looked Saraphina in the eye, the ice queen who was now beginning to sweat beneath her perfect makeup,
and mentioned the ledger. She didn't reveal its location yet, but she spoke of the numbers, the offshore accounts, and the systematic draining of the Thorn legacy. The color drained from Saraphina's face, leaving it a sickly, translucent white. She attempted to laugh it off as the delusions of a desperate criminal, but the shrillness in her voice betrayed her. Victor watched the exchange, his eyes moving between the woman he was supposed to marry and the maid who was risking everything to save him. The interrogation had stripped away the layers of social standing and expensive fabric, leaving only the raw truth of their character. Victor realized that the evidence wasn't in the jury box or the attic room. It was in the eyes of the two women. One held the steady, quiet flame of integrity. The other held the flickering, panicked shadows of a cornered predator. The private trial was no longer about a missing brooch. It was the final moment before the glass house shattered completely. The atmosphere in the library grew so thin, it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. Saraphina's laughter, once a melodic social tool, had sharpened into a jagged, desperate sound. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her black-gloved hands gesturing wildly toward the police officers, as she demanded they end this farce. She painted Maya as a master manipulator, a girl who had spent her nights weaving fantasies to cover her crimes. But Victor remained a statue behind his desk, his silence more terrifying than any shout. He didn't look at his fiancée. He looked at Maya, waiting for the final card to fall. Maya did not waver, despite the bruises on her wrists, from the handcuffs, and the exhaustion pulling at her soul. She stepped forward and asked for permission to retrieve one final piece of evidence from the master suite's adjacent study. Saraphina's protest was instantaneous and shrill, but Victor raised a single hand, silencing her with a look of such profound coldness that she physically recoiled. With an officer flanking her, Maya returned minutes later, carrying the small, leather-bound ledger she had discovered in the bowels of the chaise longue. When Saraphina saw the purple-stained cover, the last of her carefully curated mask disintegrated. Her eyes darted toward the door, but the guards stood firm, their expressions as unyielding as the stone walls. Maya placed the book on the mahogany desk next to the sapphire brooch. She began to turn the pages, her voice steady and clinical as she read aloud the dates of the transfers, the names of the shell companies, and the specific amounts of money that had been siphoned from the Thorn employee pension fund. She didn't just read the numbers. She explained the patterns, the way the thefts coincided with Victor's business trips, and the way the lost jewelry was systematically replaced by high-quality fakes. As she spoke, the officers leaned in, their professional interests shifting from a simple domestic theft to a multi-million-dollar fraud. The poor maid was no longer just a servant. She was the most observant person in the room, a witness who had seen the rot beneath the gold leaf, because she was the only one who bothered to look. But the ledger was only the beginning. Maya reached into the pocket of her tan uniform and pulled out a small digital recorder she had purchased with her very first week's wages, a tool she had initially intended to use to record her father's favorite stories, but which had become a shield against a predator. She pressed play, and the room was suddenly filled with Saraphina's voice, stripped of its public sweetness. The recording captured a conversation between Saraphina and a private broker, where she laughed about Victor's blind trust and detailed her plan to liquidate his secondary holdings the moment the marriage certificate was signed. "He thinks he's marrying a partner," the recording hissed, "but he's just buying a very expensive ghost who's going to haunt his bank accounts until there's nothing left." The silence that followed the recording was absolute. Saraphina collapsed into a velvet chair, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The black gloves she wore, once a symbol of her untouchable status, now looked like the stained hands of a thief caught in the act. Victor stood up slowly, his face a mask of such deep, resonant grief that even Maya felt a sting of pity for him. He looked at the ledger, then at the recording, and finally at the woman who had shared his bed and his secret. He realized that every "I love you" had been a transaction, and every "I support you" had been a lie designed to keep him complacent while she hollowed out his life. Victor walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Saraphina. He didn't raise his hand, and he didn't raise his voice. He simply took the sapphire brooch, the symbol of his family's legacy, and handed it to the lead officer. He stated, with a voice that sounded like ice cracking under pressure, that he wished to press full charges for fraud, embezzlement, and the framing of an innocent woman. He then turned to Maya, and for the first time since she had arrived at the Thorn estate, he bowed his head in a gesture of genuine, unvarnished respect. The poor maid had done what all the lawyers, board members and security teams could not. She had saved the man who owned the world from the woman who intended to steal it from him. The heavy oak doors of the Thorn mansion swung open for the last time for Saraphina, but there was no grand departure, no clicking of expensive heels on the driveway, and no fleet of luxury cars. Instead, there was only the cold rhythmic metallic clink of handcuffs, and the firm grip of the officers on her silk-clad arms. Her blonde hair had come undone, strands sticking to her tear-streaked face, making her look remarkably human and pathetically small. As she was led toward the waiting cruiser, the staff emerged from the recesses of the house, the cooks, the gardeners, and the other maids, standing in a silent line. They didn't jeer or shout. They simply watched the fear that had governed their lives for years be driven away in the back of a police car. The air on the estate seemed to lighten instantly, the oppressive static that had haunted the hallways dissipating like morning mist under a resolute sun. Inside the library, the silence was of a different quality. It was the quiet of a shipyard after a great storm, where the wreckage is cleared, and the foundation is finally visible. Victor Thorn stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the taillights of the police vehicle disappear past the iron gates. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest, not the pain of a broken heart, but the shock of a man who had narrowly escaped a landslide. He realized that for years, he had been curating a life of appropriateness, choosing a partner who fit the aesthetic of his empire while ignoring the rot she brought into his home. He had wanted a socialite to fill a role, but in doing so, he had nearly lost the very empire he sought to protect. He turned slowly to face Maya. She was still standing by the mahogany desk, her tan uniform wrinkled, and her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline of the trial ebbed away. She looked exhausted, a girl from a small village who had just taken down a titan of high society, yet her eyes remained as clear and steady as ever. Victor realized then that the courage he had spent his life searching for in boardrooms and high-stakes mergers had been standing right in front of him, carrying a tray of coffee and a polishing cloth. He saw that Maya didn't just have the truth. She had the kind of steel that wealth couldn't forge, and that Saraphina's cruelty couldn't temper. Victor crossed the room, stopping before her. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship, master and servant, billionaire and debtor, crumbled into nothingness. He didn't see a maid. He saw the moral anchor of his household. He told her, his voice thick with a genuine emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades, that his debt to her could never be settled with a paycheck. He informed her that her father's debts were not just paid, but that the family's land was now theirs in perpetuity. But he went further. He didn't want her to return to the shadows of the kitchen or the attic room. He offered her a position as the director of his charitable foundations, the very accounts Saraphina had tried to drain, trusting her to protect the legacy she had just saved. Maya looked at him, and for the first time, a soft, weary smile touched her lips. She didn't accept out of greed, but out of a shared understanding that the house needed to be rebuilt from the inside out. As she walked with Victor toward the grand foyer, the staff did not bow or avert their gaze. They stood tall, acknowledging the woman who had taught them that fear was a choice, and that dignity was a right. The Thorn mansion remained a place of glass and stone, but it was no longer a cave. The poor maid had changed everything, not by acquiring wealth, but by proving that the truth is the only currency that truly matters. As the sun set over the cliffs, casting a warm amber glow through the high windows, the mansion finally felt like a home, and the future felt like a promise, rather than a threat.